What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. So this is going to be on a bit of a discussion video, which leads me into immediately the topic about these two Iron Maiden albums, The X Factor from 95 and Virtual 11 from 98. Do these albums still deserve the overhating that many Maiden fans still give these albums that amount of negativity? Well, for me personally, for me being a Maiden fan, I was very indifferent at first to discover the Bayley period of Iron Maiden. And with these different lineup changes, and with the more iconic ones like Paul Di'Anno from the first two albums, and most notably the beloved period with Bruce Dickinson from The Number of the Beast to Fear of the Dark, and the later period with Dickinson and Yannick Gertz's involvement, the Bayley period has been absolutely notorious to this very day. So, for me, in my honest opinion, I will say my reasons why I think these albums don't deserve the negativity. Because when it comes to albums like The X Factor, I will say that while I am a big fan of this album and still regard it as one of the most underrated metal albums of all time, this album was made with a lot more personal direction that many people don't really think about sometimes. Obviously, we know what happened to Bruce Dickinson. During the touring of the promotion of the album Fear of the Dark, Bruce Dickinson decided to quit in a very instant amount of a choice, and that leads Steve Harris with once again without a singer. And Bayley was then selected as the new vocalist at the time for Maiden, as he was in a previous band called Wolfsbane, and actually Wolfsbane did support Iron Maiden at one point throughout their career. So after hundreds of auditions, the band decided to make Bayley the new vocalist for Iron Maiden, and with this album being their 10th studio album, and with the name of The X Factor, this is going to be something very different. But when it came out, it was very lukewarm, with many reviews disliking the sound of this album, and even remotely the sound of Bayley's vocals. Now, I have done my reviews of the Maiden discography involving these two albums, and I actually mentioned these two again in my video with the Metal Meltdown on albums we do defend that are overhated, and I had selected these two in my list. The X Factor, personally for me, has some of the darkest and best material that Steve Harris had ever written. We know what Harris went through. He was going through a divorce from his wife, he was going through depression and alcohol addiction, and with a lot of the songs on this album based on numerous things. Sign of the Cross, basically inspired from the novel of The Name of the Rose, and also The Edge of Darkness, based on the movie Apocalypse Now, and Man on the Edge, based on the movie of Falling Down. There's a lot more personal stuff on this record, especially like with 2 AM and The Unbeliever, and so far and so forth. I really do think that this sound works for the X Factor, and if you want to see my review of this album, please do check it out. And while Bayley's voice is something very different for all of the fans worldwide, I still think that Blaze was working with a lot of big shoes for working as a member for one of the biggest bands in the world. So yeah, I still am a big fan of this album, and you cannot change my mind by anything why I really do love this album. And it is still one of my high favourite Maiden albums. Now, for Virtual 11. Virtual 11 was made in different ways, And while the X Factor is a very dark record, Virtual 11 is a return back into that upbeat, more major type of direction for the writing. And when this came out, this had the worst amount of reviews. And even more insultingly, Collector's Guide to Heavy Metal has given this a 0 out of 10, which is absolutely atrocious. I know it's just a review, but I have heard worse albums that I could personally turn off and just be away from than this album. And of course, this album is the lowest selling album in the band's discography. Well, these two in particular reached the lowest amount of sales and reception. So with Virtual 11, I actually do like some of this record, though it's not as perfect, but it's nowhere near as a strong follow-up to the X Factor, because I find that this album is an underrated masterpiece. And with Virtual 11, there's been a lot of talk that they hate this album because of one song, The Angel and the Gambler. And it's still mind-boggling to me that The Angel and the Gambler was chosen as the first single. Yet alone, when you think about it, almost 5 minutes of the whole song is basically the chorus that's been repeated more than 20 times. But there are some songs on this that I actually do like Future Real and the track The Klansman, based on Braveheart. And I think The Educated Fool is a very strong song, and it's one of my favourite Maiden songs. But with the other tracks like Lightning Strikes Twice, When Two Worlds Collide, these types of songs are very, very bland and totally forgettable. And I can understand why many Maiden fans see this as the least liked across all of their albums. With my least favourite Maiden album being No Prayer for the Dying, that album had tried, but it's not enough for me to call it a great album at all, because I think that album has some of their worst material. And with Virtual 11, it's very common for most fans of Iron Maiden to say this is the worst Maiden album. But I know that there are some negatives for me on this record, like Don't Look to the Eyes of a Stranger, which personally for me is one of the worst Maiden songs of all time. The other two that I can think of are Weekend Warrior from Fear of the Dark and Hooks in You from No Prayer for the Dying, which was a part of the Charlotte the Harlot trilogy, but I really detest that song. So this album for me has moments that I really do enjoy. I think the most annoying part when people think about the Blaze Bayley era, fans will just think of Iron Maiden of Bruce Dickinson. Now here is the main thing. Iron Maiden is not all about Bruce Dickinson. Just because that Bruce Dickinson has been known as one of the greatest metal vocalists of all time and the best vocalist for Iron Maiden, Bruce Dickinson is not Iron Maiden. Paul Di'Anno is not Iron Maiden. Not even Blaze Bayley. Iron Maiden is all about Steve Harris. Steve Harris is Iron Maiden. And I know that we can't like everything Maiden has put out, but these albums on the Blaze Bayley period, I actually do defend. They've not made a bad album, yet alone I have mentioned No Prayer as my least favourite because of how below average to somewhat awful that album really was, but it was not one of the worst things ever. And, you know, I will always not change my mind by how I feel about these albums. So, do you agree? What do you think of these albums of The X Factor and Virtual 11? Please put your comments down below, and I am looking forward for a lot of Maiden fans to say what they want to say. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.